about free speech and constructive dialogue at the University of North Carolina. I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, a lot about that, what we're doing at UNC, the research that we did, and then where we're going now, right? And so for a university, the importance of free speech it's crucial, right? A university cannot do its job without free expression and academic freedom. So that's because knowledge generation and knowledge transmission for the betterment of humankind depend on it, right? That's one of our fundamental missions. Developing America and the world's future leaders, I think, is another one of our missions. Ensuring we are fostering the success and prosperity of future generations is another. And then providing students the values, the knowledge, the skills to exercise their democratic responsibilities. And so achieving those fundamental missions is really only possible via academic freedom, free expression, viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, and constructive dialogue. And so these attributes are fundamental to us achieving our mission as a university. And so one example of what's going on, I think, in today's world, because the university exists in is a microcosm of what's happening in the world today, right? So we know that a lot of Americans are polarized. And so one piece of research that came out recently was very interesting, is that conservatives and liberals are wrong about what each other believes. About a third of liberals, just 1/3 of liberals agreed that banning controversial speakers from campus, college campuses, but conservatives estimated that 63% of liberals held that view, right? So conservatives thought a lot more liberals wanted to ban speakers. Only 22% of conservatives expressed hostile attitudes towards immigrants, but liberals thought that 57% of them did. So the takeaway there is both sides are wrong about their opposites, but typically is only on culture war issues. Standard policy issues, taxes, healthcare, they're pretty good at judging where the other is. And so the other takeaway is that moderates really need to speak up about their side. So there's a lot of moderates in the middle, but that lean right or left. And so they need to reach out to the other side and also to counsel their own side and educate them that there's a lot more nuance here. There's probably a lot more things they agree on than what they think. And so the other part of society that's it's an issue is we have a lot of problems to solve, right? And there's a line of thinking called wicked problems. And so wicked problem is a problem. It's social, usually cultural. It's challenging or impossible to solve because we have different solutions being proposed by different values. You can think about liberals and conservatives, right? Sometimes we agree something must be done, but we differ greatly on what that something must be.
Yeah, right? Like housing, for example, affordable housing.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yes, yeah. Very much so, right? Not enough is understood about the problem. The number of stakeholders are usually many, right? Lots of different opinions on how things should be done, and the economic burden is huge, right? We know the explosion of government spending, both at the state and the national level, on a lot of these problems that we have is increasing. We know the debt's increasing. And so then also these problems interact, right? They're interrelated with other problems. And so some classic examples, you mentioned a couple, right? Homelessness, right? Immigration's a big one, social safety net, climate change, social justice, right? What pandemic was a big one, right? Lots of disagreement on that. So yeah, so there's these wicked problems. And so there's 4 shifts that we need to take to deal with these problems. One is moving from wicked people to wicked problems. So we tend to think our opposites are wicked people, right? They just have different values, different ways of solving some of these problems. So we got to think about, hey, we got to solve the wicked problems. And so to do that, we got to move from being adversaries to collaborators, and shifting from inciting the worst in human nature, right, to bringing out the best in human nature, and moving from having facts, right, cherry picking our facts, or fake news as facts to deal and address these wicked problems together. And so what that really says is that the only way for us to solve these, especially when we look at universities, right, a lot of people look to universities to address these problems, right, to think about these problems, it's only possible through constructive dialogue. And so that's one of the efforts that UNC has been working on. And I'm just one of many players there, right? There's a lot of people involved in working on these problems, from our chancellor to the provost to Some formal programs like the program for public discourse, informal groups as well. So there's a lot of people that understand there is an issue and are working on it. So yeah, I don't want people to leave here thinking Mark McNeilly's.
You don't want them to send all the angry emails to you?
No, I mean, I think I don't want to take credit for what a lot of other people are doing, right? There's a lot of work going on. So yeah. And so some things that have been going on at UNC that I think have been good, right? So FIRE, which is a group that looks at free expression on campus and now has expanded really to free expression throughout the United States or even through the world, because the ACLU, as you know, has kind of given up that role. They looked at speech codes on campuses, right? And a lot of campuses had speech codes, especially ones in North Carolina. Not especially, but also ones in North Carolina. And UNC got rid of their speech codes, which, you know, they were meant to, you know, ensure that, you know, we worked, you know, together, but they also infringed on the First Amendment, right? So we got rid of those speech codes. Many universities in North Carolina did. And so we got, along with many other ones, a FIRE's green light rating in 2015. We adopted, as I mentioned, the University of Chicago principles on free speech in 2018. The program for public discourse was created in 2019. And they put on a lot of programs for us that model constructive discourse. So that's been one of the big efforts at UNC. It's run by Sarah Truell, and right now Molly Worthen is sitting in for her for that. But that's a big program. FIRE does a ranking of over 200 universities, and UNC came in the top 15% in terms of free expression, which is pretty good. Either that or the other ones are really, really bad. So the trustees then adopted.
But moving in the right direction.
Right.
Top 10 next
year.
year.
Yeah. The trustees adopted the University of Chicago's statement on free speech as well, just recently in middle of 2022, and the Calvin Report. And a lot of people don't know what the Calvin Report is. Calvin Report calls for institutional neutrality. So this is, again, a University of Chicago thing. So institutional neutrality really says that rather than a university or any departments within a university going off and making statements on social issues of the day, the university as an institution, the departments, all the leadership people basically abstain from doing that. So the institution doesn't take a stand on these issues, so that professors and students feel like they can take stands on these issues. So the freedom remains for faculty and students, and it's now greater because the leadership is abstaining from taking positions, because it's very hard as a professor, right, to take a position that's counter to what you know, your leadership has said.
And you're more likely probably to self-censor, even though, you know, if they do have some sort of institutional stand and it's at odds with your own personal stance.
Oh yeah, and there's a lot of self-censorship, I would say. I mean, one of the things I'd like to do is do some research like we did on students, but do that with faculty. Because I think we have anecdotal data. I know of professors who are, and including myself, who, you know, we stay away from certain topics in class because it's really not worth the potential downside. Right? There's very limited upside and extreme downside. So the other thing that happened is the Faculty Council adopted a resolution on the rights and duties of faculty members to speak freely, and the duty of the university to protect faculty. That was also in last year. So getting into the research a little bit. So as I mentioned, it's an interdisciplinary team. Jennifer from English and Comparative Lit, Timothy Ryan from Political Science, myself from the Business School. Again, Tim, you know, being the real chops on the methodology, and he took the lead on this last study that we did across multiple universities, and was the lead researcher on that. And so this was done. This research was done. So the Board of Governors looked at what we did in 2019 for UNC and said, hey, we want you to replicate that across 8 universities in the UNC system, which I think was a great idea. And the Board of Governors and the universities funded it. And we presented to the Board of Governors in May and the UNC Board of Trustees in July. So they were, App State was one, NC Central, UNC Asheville, UNC Chapel Hill, Charlotte, Greensboro, Pembroke, Wilmington. Those were the universities that we did the research at. We had local research partners at each institution. We got random samples of students to participate. We incented them because we wanted to make sure it wasn't just the people who were the most upset or the most happy with things that responded. We got about 3,400 responses. Yeah, and the samples generally come close to campus demographics, right? And so the findings were directionally consistent across the 8 universities. There were a couple of differences in a couple of places, but pretty much all universities, the findings were consistent across those, and also directionally consistent with lots of other research from other organizations, whether that was Knight Foundation, Heterodox Academy, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, although they've now changed that name again for their focus, the wider focus. American College Student Freedom Research. So it's not like our research is like, wow, it's over here, right? I mean, all the research pretty much says the same stuff, right? Ours is just specific to North Carolina's universities. And so getting into this, right, so we looked at self-described ideology by university. And so within UNC Chapel Hill, so I'm only going to be talking now about Chapel Hill, UNC, about 60% were liberal, 15% were moderate, 15% were conservative, about 11% were undefined, right? So skews, obviously, among the student population, quite liberal. We did find, we had 4 findings, sort of 2 positive, 2 not so good. One is faculty generally do not push political agendas, right? We had a question of the percentage who disagree that the course instructor encouraged participation from liberals and conservatives alike, and it was, you can see that in the slides, right, very low numbers. Only 2% of liberals disagreed that the instructors were encouraging participation, and 11% of conservatives. So those are pretty low numbers, right? Then we kind of got into some of the other findings that maybe weren't so great. We saw that campuses across the system, including UNC, don't consistently achieve an atmosphere that promotes free expression, right? So concerned about they're concerned about their peers. If they speak out, students are concerned about their peers. About 35% of students are concerned about if they, say something wrong. 24% are concerned about their instructor. Self-censored more than once. About 18% of students at UNC self-censored. And then some other things that we saw as well that were somewhat concerning. We said, hey, if you have a statement that you find objectionable, what would you do? And 16% of students said they would create an obstruction to that speaker that was saying that. Yeah, firing the professor, which is pretty hard, pretty home, was 1 out of 5. Report a student was 1 out of 10, pretty much. So that's concerning. And generally what we find is students are more concerned about their peers than they are their professors. I mean, there's a concern about both, but it's really more, and this is again directionally consistent across the other research from other organizations, is they're concerned about their peers, right? And so the third finding was that students who identify as conservative face distinctive challenges. So the percent concerned that if they stated their sincere political views, that the peers would have a lower opinion. 83% of conservatives were concerned about that, compared to 24% of liberals. Concerned that if they stated their views, their professor would have a lower opinion of them. 72% of conservatives, 13% of liberals. And the ones in terms of self-censoring more than once, 54% of conservatives self-censored more than once, and 9% of liberals. And there was no appreciable difference on these questions between demographics like male, female, non-binary, or white versus non-white.
Okay, so it really is the fulcrum here is conservative versus liberal.
Yeah, it's political point of view. It's not demographics. We found some other data in terms of your willingness to socialize with people who disagree with you. So the percent that disagree with or really would not be willing to have a member of the out group, right? Their political out group, so a liberal to a conservative. 36% of liberals did not weren't willing to have a conservative as a friend. About 6% of conservatives, only about 6% of conservatives felt the same way about liberals. Willing to have them as a classmate was about 34% of liberals.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So, and you got to remember, 60% of the students on campus are liberals. So, if you're a conservative, you're already in the minority.
It's very isolating.
It is isolating. So, I mean, that's one of the things you got to think about as a student. Is like, is it worth it? It's a big thing about college is your social life, right? And if you out yourself, am I now going to be ostracized, right? Have I now, reduced my ability to have friends, reduced my ability to, find a partner, right? All those things. So it's about 20% of conservatives didn't really want to have an out-group member or liberal as a classmate. And about 20% of students of liberal students thought conservatives were an important group of part of campus. About 4%, only 4% of conservatives thought liberal students weren't an important part of the campus community. And then getting back to stereotypes that we talked about, right? So again, political views of each other. So these were opinions, liberals of conservatives, conservatives of liberals. Only 44% of liberals perceived conservative students as intelligent, and 72% saw them as conservative students as racist, or 73% saw them as condescending. Conservatives, on the other hand, about 80% of those saw liberal students as intelligent, but about 93% saw them as condescending. So you can see a lot of, you can see this polarization, right, and the perceptions that people have.
Well, yeah, when one group is more likely to think you're not very smart at all, then of course the perception on the receiving end is, yeah, you're condescending. So that just pairs nicely in a tragic way.
Yeah, and whenever you look on social media, it's always the assumptions the other group has of, the opposite. So, so ending us on a positive finding, we did see that UNC students across the political spectrum did want more opportunities to engage with those who think differently. So, 32% of liberals thought there were too few opportunities to hear conservative speakers, which I think is a pretty good number. 86% of conservatives felt the same way. They wanted to hear more conservative speakers. And 50% of liberal students thought there were too few opportunities to engage constructively with conservatives, and 67% of conservatives thought there were too few opportunities to engage constructively with liberal students. That's something that we need as a university to work on. And so one of the quotes I really like from Abraham Lincoln, he said this during the Civil War, is he said, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Right? And that's really what I think constructive discourse can help us do, right? So moving forward, where do I think we're going, and where do a lot of other folks who are supportive of academic freedom and free expression on campus, where do they want to go? Well, let me first describe the university environment, because a lot of people don't understand the university environment. It's very different from, I worked in a corporation, I was in the military. Very different environments than a university, right? So a university is focused on teaching and research. It's faculty-led. It's highly decentralized, unlike a corporation, which tend to be extremely centralized. There's a lot of constituencies, both internal and external. Our chancellor says, running a university is like, being the mayor of a town, right? There's all these different constituencies you need to deal with. And consensus building is crucial, right? Because it is highly decentralized. So top-down directives tend to not be very effective. And you really got to engage the faculty to get to some level of consensus. You've got to engage your external constituencies. Alumni are important, obviously. Legislature, governor, those are all important. People, the public, right, the taxpayer. And to do that, building trust is crucial. Right now, I would say there's a huge trust gap, not just on campus, throughout the United States, right? There's trust in it. You look at any data, the trust in institutions is going down. Trust in the other side is going down. And the other thing about a university you need to realize is you can't expect fast change, right? So if it's not highly centralized and top-down directives don't work, right, saying something at the top is not going to change stuff at the bottom. So moving forward, there's a number of items we're working on. I've just got a short list here, right? So the program for public discourse, the momentum is going to continue, right? I think there's going to be great things that program continues to do in terms of modeling constructive behavior and helping students get the constructive dialogue skills they need. I've started just an informal academic freedom listserv of professors, of faculty that are interested in academic freedom. And we have lots of great conversations, and it reflects the different political views on campus. Probably, I would say, more conservative people on there than liberal faculty, which is probably a different experience for the liberal faculty to be in a little group that is not heavily skewed liberal. We'll be starting soon, so the Heterodox Academy, they're an organization that focuses on building constructive dialogue. They're starting a program across the United States at multiple campuses. I think 23 campuses are in the first wave of these campus communities they're starting, and UNC was selected to be one of those. So I'm going to be working on that along with Courtney Wright and Kevin Marinelli. They're professors as well. And Kevin Marinelli is the executive director of the program for public discourse. And then the chancellor just announced at the January faculty council meeting that he is going to charter a committee on academic freedom and free expression. So this will be composed primarily of faculty, some staff as well, a couple students, to look and think about, okay, what does UNC need to do to move forward on academic freedom? I think one of the things that the committee will be looking at is we have a lot of the policies in place, right? And the principles, right? The University of Chicago Statement, Calvin, et cetera. It's really a culture thing, right? So how do we change the culture? And it's difficult as well because we, again, are a microcosm of what's happening around us. So so the thing I would like to say is, again, there's a lot of people working on this. There's a lot of faculty that are engaged in this. Some students, the administration is very much looking for ways to improve constructive discourse, free expression, academic freedom. I think the Board of Trustees and the Board of Governors are looking at ways to do that as well. So, when I think about an organization, again, having come from the corporate world, is like, okay, do we recognize there's an issue and are we working on it, right? It would have been easy for the organization to say, like, let's just not even talk about that, right? Kudos, I would say, to the system for realizing there is an issue, and then starting to work on it. So,
yeah. That is, despite the fact that some of those findings about alienation of conservatives it shows there's a lot of work yet to do. But hearing the stories of the ways in which the UNC school system and other universities and folks like you are actually making strides on this front. That's so encouraging, not only just as a parent whose children are college bound, but also as a taxpayer of the state who, our tax dollars are invested into the system. And as just a citizen of the country, you want a healthy culture that is going to promote diversity of thought, pluralism, and appreciation and respect for others. So I just have a couple of questions. And then again, if you're watching online, we'll try to get to your questions later, but please feel free to post them and we'll share those later with Professor McNeilly. But you mentioned culture and how crucial that is. So how can K-12 schools and families of young children help prepare their children for a pluralist society where they can listen to these viewpoints, so it's not that they want to otherize a conservative or a liberal, but they're willing to make that table a little bigger?
I mean, it's been a while since I've had children in the K through 12 system, but looking at a lot of the things that have been happening around K through 12, I think they face a lot of the same issues that higher education does in terms of the culture as well, right? And that's why I think you see a lot of legislatures around the country making efforts, right, to in their view rein some of these movements that are happening in K through 12 in. I think what and this is probably going to differ from a lot of people because this whole thing is about me speaking from my own viewpoint, not the university's. But so I think civic education has to go to be front and center for what we do, and then even teaching students at the K through 12 level, right? How to have constructive dialogue, and the teachers there to have constructive dialogue as well. I mean, that's important. And to be honest with you, I mean, I think it's questionable in some. My personal view is that I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of public systems to do. And so I think the voucher system approach is a way to shake that up and offer a lot of other educational alternatives. The parents can then have a chance to pick from. I know, if you look at, a lot of folks think that vouchers are there for the rich, but the research shows that minorities are very strongly in favor, and as well as folks in lower socioeconomic groups, right? And so, yeah, what parent wouldn't want to have multiple choices of where to send their child and go and have them have a chance to go to a school that shares their values and gives them the education that the parents think is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Well, just hearing that answer is like music to my ears. I know, especially here at the John Locke Foundation, we're advancing school choice, celebrating things like the Opportunity Scholarship Program and the Education Savings Accounts. These are just these are wonderful ways that funding can follow students so that they can access that education that they deserve and need, so that they're well prepared to go into a university or straight to the workforce, but hopefully in a way where they're actually ready to embrace the diverse, plural society that the United States is.
Yeah, and I think the good news is that, I think pre-pandemic this was primarily a conservative, I would say only a conservative approach, but you're starting to see Democratic politicians getting on board. And that would be great, right? It's not like, hey, we want. It's also sort of like free speech. A lot of people say free speech is a conservative issue. It's like, it's like, no, I want everybody to own it. We should all own free speech, right? We should all own academic freedom. It's not something that should only belong to one side. I want liberals to support those same principles, because their speech is just as important.
And that's at the heart of the word liberal, even, is just this understanding that pluralism is central to having a liberal society, one that relies heavily on liberty. And okay, so I just have one more question for you, and that's, what was the reception like, especially among your fellow professors and other academics, for this sort of program and steering the UNC system this way?
Well, I think like anything, you get people that say, "Wow, yeah, that's actually what I've been seeing," right, and agree with it. They might quibble with some things here or there, and I think there is a group that is like does not want to accept the findings, so they find any way they could to like challenge the methodology, right, or like where'd you get your funding, right? Those came from the universities, So yeah, and so which I think is unfortunate. Another thing I often hear is like, well, sure, everyone self-censors, right? There's stuff you don't say, or probably a good thing. And the thing that this one disturbed me was like, it's probably a good thing those conservatives are self-censoring because they're going to say something horrible, right? And it's like, and so one of the things we did in this research is we asked students that, like, hey, you're going to self-censor. Or when you did self-censor, what was it you're going to say? Right, so we have verbatims of what they said they were going to say, and we dug through those, and I've gone personally through half of those. I haven't found anything that wouldn't have been appropriate for a classroom conversation. So,
But when you're afraid that you're going to be perceived by your fellow classmates as unintelligent or racist or condescending, then there is that inclination too. So.
Oh yeah. I had a law student, and when we did the study back in 2018, she came up to me and she said, I wanted to bring up a point in class about a position on a paper, right, or on a court case, right? I wanted to just tell people, well, look, there's this view that's out there that's different from what the other views that we've been talking about, but because it was a conservative view, she she didn't feel like she could even say it, right? It wasn't even necessarily her view, right? But it was like, I can't even give a conservative view in this class without being pegged as a conservative. So, you know, that's an anecdote, but I think the data bear out the anecdotes. You know, it's not like we're cherry picking a couple anecdotes and saying there's a problem. I think that, you know, if you look, you know, with an open mind at the data, and you look at with an open mind at the methodology, I think you know, people will see that there is an issue, and again, the good thing is that we're working on it. So.
Yeah, that's encouraging, and looking forward to us maybe revisiting this conversation in a year to hear how it's going and how those implementations have been going, and see if you have been able to witness some of the culture change there. I know that's a multi-year process.
Yeah, that's a multi-year process.
But maybe there will be more anecdotes that are of the encouraging nature. So thank you so much for joining us, for sharing this. You all can follow this work at, where should they be able to follow this sort of project? We will certainly be covering it at Carolina Journal.
It's not like we run out and it's not like we have a website where we like, here's all the stuff we're doing. It's an interesting idea. It's mostly, you know, well, it'll be interesting because one of the people on our, well, actually, that's maybe not correct. I don't know. I think we'll have to think about what is the way to get the word out, because I think that is, you know, there's always two problems. Are you doing anything on the problem, right? And if you're doing anything on the problem, have you told anybody about it, right? And so, you know, getting that message out, I think, is important for the university, because I think, you know, there are lots of perceptions about universities, UNC in particular. And so, you know, I think it's important to tell the story that we're working on this. And there's also a lot of great things that, you know, UNC does in terms of research and teaching that, because of these other issues, right, people don't see or people forget, right? And so, you know, I think it's important to tell the whole story about UNC and not just a part of it.
Yeah, we'll certainly be covering just how this is evolving, and I know you write at the Heterodox Academies.
Yeah, I've written a few things for them. Yep.
And you have your own Substack that people can subscribe to. We're going to talk about ChatGPT eventually.
I hope so. Yeah, definitely.
So thank you so much for joining us, and please leave your questions or additional thoughts there in the chat. We welcome that, and thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for investing your time as well as your treasure into liberty by supporting the John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal, and we hope to see you again soon.